Hey, it's Brad. So fear is an urgent awareness of caution, where caution is some sort of a attention to the boundaries against a risk of danger, and that awareness is the passive input that can trigger the active response of attention to a subject. But the risk is the expectation of a negative outcome in particular. And then the urgency is just the severity of that outcome. But urgency is similarly severe for positive outcome. And that's generally just at the like neuron level at first, but then larger patterns interfere and override. But it's all just pleasure versus pain. That it's just a 1 or 0. And then the possibility and probability of, and then chance of those occurrences, those outcomes. If it's negative, it goes as risk. And if it's positive, then it's just objective. But all of those combine at next step up, where the risk becomes caution, the anticipation of the good parts are hope, and then caution, where it gets distilled into fear, or really just generates that fear by propagating the urgency. Hope becomes excitement, and those are both sustained and really activated forms of the pain and pleasure in joy and misery, especially when reiterated. But that's just a very simple neurological approach to it, the way it's laid out anyway. And if you take it that way, then pain, whether it's some sort of cognitive dissonance or grieving, it's just remapping a pathway. It's just your node saying, hey, this is not the return I expected on that energy investment. I'm gonna reallocate things. And then it does. And sometimes that causes separations or cell death or waste or whatever else. Propagating additional changes up the chain is inherently uncertain, because you never really know, what it's going to cost. So those operations are not just difficult to evaluate. The way that we evaluate them, brain pings it, says, "Hey, what's this going to cost me?" I don't know. It doesn't say anything. And this is, it's similar to, when you try to make something happen neurologically and it doesn't, like having a really drained day and you go to try to get up and you physically, like, you're sending the signals for your body to get up and it just doesn't get up at all. Won't even move. And you can try to force it through and tell your body, you can do it, you're just confused, it's just signals. And then if you do push through, there's a chance you can hurt yourself. But either way, the pain is just there to notify you that something's going wrong. Like, here's a point, a pain point, where there's a strain. And that's just to help you identify it, so you can work with it, work it out, work around it, or just ignore it and just know that that's the cost of taking this action. And then the flip side, like pretty much inverse of that whole dynamic, is accepting the bad parts of good things and the good parts of bad things. Like when a loved one dies, but if you're having to care for them frequently, well, just because that task was a burden, like a chore, like just a thing on your list, nothing, no negative connotation to the word, weighing it down. But they were not a burden. Or at least that's not the same as saying that the task was a burden. It's not the same as calling the person a burden. And you shouldn't feel bad about appreciating the silver linings of any sort of tragedy. Because that's exactly the way that God or an optimist or, I mean, a history book that's trying to spin things so that it can explain everything to kids, it's going to twist it to the best possible context. And that brings me to one of the interesting thoughts that keeps popping back up in my head in Genesis, where it says, God said, "Let there be light," and there was light, and God saw that the light was good. Well, it's at least an interesting thought to consider it as being God saw the light that was good. Like, he only sees that which is good, just like, over time pain fades. And all you're left with is the story of how that built into some sort of a positive payoff. So at the end of time, or at least the end of your story, the payoff is pretty much dependent on having rolled with it. And the more pain you've learned from, the more experience you've gotten. And I guess it's always nice to level up.